Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program on navigating Social Security disability, eligibility, application, and appeals. My name is Siobhán Alvarez, and I'm the Executive Director of the Atlanta Autism Consortium. If this is your first time joining one of our programs, welcome. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating collaborative connections throughout the Metro Atlanta autism community. We host free programs and events every month and aim to serve the spectrum at large, including parents and family members, adults with autism, researchers, clinicians, and educators. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please know that if you are an attendee, your microphone will remain muted, as will your camera, but you can feel free to ask any questions throughout the event by typing them into the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Once we get started, I'll add a note in there, that way everyone sees it. Feel free to ask any questions you have throughout tonight's panel. After the presentation, we will also have a Q&A session to wrap up the night with our panelists. You will also receive an email tomorrow with access to the presentation that is being shared, so don't worry about keeping up with notes. Just enjoy the information and feel free to ask a lot of questions. We will also be sure that you receive the contact information for both our panelists and our moderator this evening. Tonight, we are joined by expert Social Security attorney Anjel Burgess of Burgess and Christensen and attorney Laura Akins-Smith of Nadler Biernath, who will also be serving as our moderator. Laura, would you like to take things from here?
Yes. Hi, everybody. As Siobhán said, my name is Laura Akins-Smith. I am on the board at AAC and also, like she said, an attorney at Nadler Biernath. And when we were planning tonight's seminar, we were thinking about futures planning. And of course, at Nadler Biernath, we do a lot of special needs trust and benefit eligibility issues. But something we're always getting questions about and always looking for information on is the Social Security application process and kind of the ins and outs of navigating through the massive bureaucracy that is the Social Security Administration. And so I was so happy to invite Anjel Burgess on tonight. We work with her regularly, and she's extremely competent in this work. She's the managing attorney at Burgess and Christensen, and extremely good at all of this stuff and at giving information in a way that kind of makes sense. So we're going to get great information tonight. I'm going to be managing the chat just as we go along. We'll do a Q&A at the end, but if there are things I can easily answer, I'll kind of do that along the way. But just know that we're paying attention and we'll get to questions at the end. And Anjel, from there, I'll let you take it.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you all for having me. I am going to share my screen so that we can get started. Okay, so today we are going to talk about navigating Social Security disability. We're going to discuss eligibility issues, the application process, and also discuss some information about appeals and things that you need to know when filing. Now, before we get started, I'm an attorney, so I have to give this disclaimer. I am in private practice at my law firm. I'm not affiliated with the Social Security Administration, so the opinions that are expressed today are solely my own and not the opinions of the Social Security Administration employees or the entity as a whole. Let's talk first about a few misconceptions that people have about Social Security disability benefits. And trust me when I say there are a lot, but here I just wanted to highlight a few of the most common. One is that having a specific diagnosis means that you will automatically be approved for disability. In most cases, that is not true. It takes a lot more than a diagnosis typically to get approved for disability. And you'll see as we talk about the process that it's more about the symptoms that you're experiencing from the condition and how they affect your ability to function appropriately. Another misconception is that an adult child should qualify for disability because they can't make enough money making minimum minimum wage. They're not able to live off of minimum wage. Therefore, they should be found disabled. That's a misconception. Another is that disability benefits are only available to people who have worked and paid into the system. I'm excited to talk to you all about that, especially as it relates to future planning. Another misconception is that if your doctor says that you're disabled, Social Security is going to agree. They have to agree. That is not true, unfortunately. And we'll talk a little bit more later on in the presentation about opinions from doctors and how Social Security evaluates those. Another big misconception is that you cannot be disabled and work at the same time. You actually can. So now that we've gone over a couple of misconceptions, I want to talk about the different programs involved with disability. Now, most of you have probably heard of at least one of these programs, and that's SSI. SSI stands for Supplemental Security Income. The other program is known as SSDI, which is Social Security Disability Insurance, or some people call it DIB, Disability Insurance Benefits. So they are two very different programs, and depending on whether or not you meet certain qualifications, you could qualify for one or both of the programs. Starting with SSI, SSI is really the program that's known as the safety net. So it's thought of a bit of as a welfare type program because you have to fall below certain income and asset guidelines in order to qualify for SSI. So it's really designed to help people in financial need that have a disability. SSI is available both to adults and to children. It tends to be a fixed payment, and I say tends to be because for 2022, SSI can pay you up to $841 per month, but the amount that you receive is going to depend on various factors, including, if you're working, if you have any other source of income. So that can change your payment from $841, and it could go down to a lesser amount, even all the way down to $0, depending on what your income and assets look like. SSI also comes with Medicaid health insurance, which I know is critical to many members of the community because of some of the other benefits besides medication that Medicaid offers. On the flip side, we've got the SSDI or DIB program, which is known as the Workers Program. So that's the program where if you are a W-2 employee, you'll see on your paycheck, every paycheck, that you're paying FICA taxes. And so the FICA that you're paying, part of that is funding your retirement. Part of it is funding the Disability and Survivors Benefits Program. So it is an insurance program. It is not income or asset sensitive. And the payment that you would receive each month if you were on SSDI is going to depend on how much you have paid into the system through working. Now, SSDI comes with Medicare health insurance as opposed to Medicaid. So when you're eligible for SSDI, essentially you are treated as if you are of full retirement age, even though you're not. And so the Medicare health insurance that comes with SSDI is the same Medicare that you would typically get at age 65. So as I stated earlier, SSI it's a federal income supplement program. It's funded by the general revenue taxes. It's designed to help people who are disabled, who are older individuals, or who are blind, people that have little to no income, and it's designed to help to make sure that you're able to meet your basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, and of course, it comes with Medicaid health insurance. Now, as I mentioned earlier with SSI, that monthly payment can vary depending on income. It can vary depending on your assets. So, for example, if you get a job, then your SSI payment, even if you're working part-time, your SSI payment is most likely going to be reduced because there's another source of income that is coming in, and SSI is going to be reduced based off of that. Similarly, if you are living with someone and you're not responsible for paying rent, your SSI benefits are going to be reduced for every month that you're living with somebody else who's providing the shelter on your behalf. Now, for SSI, for single individuals, the limit on your assets and income is $2,000. So just to give you an example, if you've got, if you're a single adult and you have $3,000 or $2,500 in your bank account and you try to apply for SSI, you're going to have problems because you've got more money than SSI allows you to have in resources. For a married couple, the limits are a little higher. Instead of $2,000, it's $3,000. But it is important to know that if you're married, your spouse's income is your income. It's deemed to be your income as well. So even if you're not working, if your spouse works and makes above what Social Security considers to be a qualifying amount for SSI, if your spouse is making $50,000 a year, then you're not going to qualify for SSI, even though you personally do not work. Similarly, if your spouse has assets, a 401k, stocks, all of those things can and will disqualify you from SSI eligibility. Social Security has a great website that you can go to if you've got questions about whether you can qualify for SSI, and that's www.ssabest.benefits.gov. Now, SSDI benefits, as I stated, are primarily based on how much you've worked and paid into the system. If you're self-employed, then you're paying SECA taxes, and the amount of money that you're paying there is what is going to count toward your SSDI benefit amount and towards your retirement. So what happens with SSDI is as you work and you pay into the system, you are earning quarters of coverage. So that's where the insurability aspect comes into play. And so as you're paying these taxes, you're earning quarters of coverage, which protects you in the event that you become disabled and unable to work. Now, one big difference between SSDI and SSI is for SSDI, the amount that you get every month is going to be consistent because it's not based upon any income or assets. So you can have $12 million in the bank and your SSDI payment is still going to be the same every month. There are, generally speaking, cost of living increases which occur each year, and that can and does increase the benefit amount, but again, it's static once you have that increase go into effect. Now with SSDI, instead of getting Medicaid health insurance, you get Medicare health insurance. The only bad thing about that is that you have to wait 29 months from the time that you are found to be disabled in order to get Medicare. So you have to make sure that you have access to healthcare through some other avenue. Could be the marketplace, could be a spouse, because you've got 29 months that you have to wait until you can get that Medicare health insurance. Medicare is thought to be typically widely available in terms of being able to find a doctor that accepts Medicare. There is one exception to the SSDI workers benefit rule, and that is for disabled adult child or also known as childhood disability benefits. But pretty much anyone is going to call it DAC, or disabled adult child benefits. And I wanted to talk with you all today about disabled adult child benefits because it's so important for planning for the future if you have an adult child with disabilities. So here's how the program works. In order to qualify as a disabled adult child, you have to be at least 18 years old. You must have a disability which began before you turned age 22. So the window for DAC benefits is you're proving that you became disabled sometime between 18 and right before, the day before you turn 22. For most people, especially when we're dealing with conditions such as autism, it's lifelong, right? You say, oh, that's easy. I can prove, my son has had autism his entire life. Well, it doesn't quite work that way because the focus is going to be, what do the records, what does the evidence prove between age 18 and right before you turn 22? Does it establish, number one, that you have autism or that you had autism, and number two, that it was so severe that it would keep you from working full-time on a competitive basis? You must also be unmarried in order to qualify for DAC benefits. You must not have engaged in what Social Security calls substantial gainful activity, or what I like to say is you must not have made too much money in order to qualify. So substantial gainful activity is a threshold that changes each year, usually not by a whole lot. And you need to stay under that threshold in order to be eligible for disability benefits at all. For 2022, that amount is $1,350 gross per month. So if you think that your adult child may qualify for this program, you want to make sure that he or she has never earned above SGA. As a parent, you must be disabled, retired, or deceased in order for your adult child to qualify for benefits under this program. So for most of you watching, you probably don't qualify right now because you may not, as the parent, be disabled or retired. And if you're watching, you're certainly not deceased. But you want to plan for the future so that when one of those events takes place, your adult child may qualify for benefits. And the great thing about this program is that your adult child is qualifying for benefits based off of your work history. So even if your adult child has never worked, they can qualify for disabled adult child benefits based off of your work history, as long as they meet the requirements that I've just gone over. Also, having a disabled adult child and having them qualify based off of your work history does not have any impact on you getting your retirement or your disability benefits. So it doesn't reduce the amount of money that you receive in retirement or disability. Instead, each individual has an amount that you receive for disability or retirement, and then there's a family maximum. So your disabled adult child can receive benefits well in excess of what they may be entitled to from SSI because you as a parent have worked and paid into the system. So let me give you an example. We have Johnny. Johnny is 53 years old and has an unmarried 21-year-old son named Barry. Barry has autism. Barry has never worked. When Barry turned 18, he started receiving SSI, or 19, and he receives the maximum amount, $841 a month, and he receives Medicaid. So Barry continues to receive SSI every year. He meets all the qualifications, and then boom, Johnny retires 13 years later, and when Johnny files for his retirement, he should be asked, do you have any disabled adult children? Or if he's not asked, he needs to make sure that Social Security knows, hey, I've got a disabled adult child. At this point in time, since 13 years have passed, Barry is 34 years old, still unmarried, never worked, but Barry may become eligible for benefits as a disabled adult child, and he might receive $1,100 a month instead of the $841 a month. He may also be eligible to keep his Medicaid, which is so important so that he can receive access to various community programs and services. Barry will also be eligible for Medicare after 24 months. So it's a great program because it allows your adult child to reap the benefits of your work and your contribution to the Disability and Retirement Fund. So even if you don't meet those requirements today as a parent, you want to make sure that you plan for the event that you retire, possibly become disabled or deceased. So if you are self-employed, please make sure that you are paying your SECA taxes, because that's what's going to impact your adult son or daughter's eligibility. If you're not paying any, you're not paying into the system, and then they're not going to qualify for a disabled adult child later on. If your child qualifies as a disabled adult child, like I said, they may be able to keep their Medicaid if the only thing that makes them ineligible is that they're getting a higher benefit amount based off of you as a parent. So you would want to contact the local Department of Family and Children Services to see if your adult child can keep their Medicaid now that they have transitioned to a disabled adult child program. I do want to take a few minutes to go over disability benefits for children, just in case there are some of you that are watching that have minor children that you think may qualify for disability. So disability benefits for children are available from birth through the age of 18. And those disability benefits are through SSI, Supplemental Security Income. Now, because SSI is an income and asset sensitive program, your child's eligibility is going to be based off of you as a parent, making sure that you qualify for the financial aspect of disability. So regardless as to what the child's condition is or how severe it is, if as a parent, if you make too much money, your child is not going to qualify for SSI until possibly age 18, when Social Security starts looking at the child's personal income and assets and not the parent's income and assets. And that's called deeming, when Social Security says, okay, basically as the parent, we are going to deem a portion of your resources, your income, your assets, or your spouse's income and assets to the child to see if the child is eligible for SSI. But if there are no issues with resources, if you meet the financial requirements, then the way that Social Security looks at disability for children is completely different than the way that they look at disability for adults. Disability for children is actually quite complicated because the rules and regulations are really vague. So it can be much more difficult to prove disability for a child than for an adult. So what Social Security says about children is In order for the child to qualify, the child cannot be engaged in substantial gainful activity. So the child cannot be working and making too much money. And the child has to have a condition or a combination of conditions that's going to result in marked and severe functional limitations. So basically what they're looking at is they're looking to see, how does your child function every day and in all settings? So at home, at school, just anywhere that your child is. How does your child function in all settings as compared to other children of the same age who do not have those conditions? Sounds like it would be easy, but they make it very complicated. The first thing that Social Security does when they're looking at children's cases is they classify the children based upon age. And so they have expectations that, from ages 3 to 6, the child ought to be able to do A, B, and C, which is going to be different than from ages 12 to 18. So they're looking at, and they establish certain developmental milestones of sorts that they're expecting your child to have based off of their age. Then what Social Security does is they have a sequential analysis. So it's steps that they go through to determine whether or not the child meets the requirements for disability. Is the child engaged in age-appropriate activity? Does the child have a severe impairment that will last at least a year? In most cases, especially when we're talking about autism, yes, that one's easy. The next thing that they'll look at is the condition listed in the Code of Federal Regulations? So there are a group of listings that's based off of systems, and I'll show you the listings as we talk about the adult portion. The child's listings is very close, sometimes mirrors the adult's listing. Now, most people, whether you're an adult or a child, do not meet a listing because the requirements are very strict. And so the expectation is that a very small percentage of people that get approved for disability actually meet a listing. They get approved for disability because their condition is so severe that for a child, it's going to prevent age-appropriate activity and function as compared to their same age peers that do not have limitations. So Social Security looks at the child as a whole child. Doesn't matter what the condition is, they look at the child as a whole child, and they look at 6 domains of functioning. And they go through an analysis at each domain to see how severely your child is impacted in that domain. So the first domain is acquiring and using information. How well does your child learn new things, use the things or information that's learned, retain information? Those are the types of things that they look at in that first domain of functioning. The second is attending and completing tasks. How well does your child pay attention, focus, complete things that he or she has started? Do they need help doing that? So that's what the second domain, attending and completing tasks, looks at. The third is interacting with others. How well does your child socialize? Does he or she socialize appropriately based upon their age? How well do they interact with other people? Is there any physical violence toward others? Do you get along with your family members? Do you have friends? Do you interact the way that a child of that particular age is expected to interact? How well do you respond to instruction or criticism from others? All of those things are considered in the domain of interacting and relating with others. The fourth is moving about and manipulating objects. So can your child write in an age-appropriate manner? Are they able to do things like tie their shoes? Are there any issues with dexterity? hopping on one foot, riding a bicycle, doing the things that one would expect that a child of that age without any impairments is able to do. The fifth domain is caring for himself or herself. And in this domain, Social Security is looking at things like, how well does your child express wants and needs? Does your child have tantrums? Do they throw things? Are they aggressive? Do they know how to appropriately deal with anger? So that's a domain that we often see has limitations in children with autism. The caring for himself or herself domain, interacting with others, oftentimes attending and completing tasks, and sometimes acquiring and using information. And the last domain is health and physical well-being. So this domain looks at, does your child, because of their conditions, have to be hospitalized frequently, or is there intensive medication that's required? Do they need IVs? Do they have, repeated episodes which affect their functioning? So Social Security goes through each one of these domains, and they determine whether your child has no limitation in the domain, a less than marked limitation, a marked limitation, or an extreme limitation. And the domains are rated either based off of, if we're looking at standardized testing, they will look at how many standard deviations below the mean. So if we're looking at things like IQ testing and other objective types of tests, then they'll look to see how many deviations below the mean your child is. If they are 3 or more, then that's extreme. And if your child is rated as extreme in one of the 6 domains, then they will be found disabled. If their child is not extreme, but is marked, and so marked would be from a kind of standardized test, would be 2 deviations, standard deviations below the mean, or your impairments interfere seriously with your ability to initiate, sustain, or complete activities, and that can be in any of those 6 domains. So if your child has 2 marked limitations out of 6 domains, then he or she will be found disabled. So it sounds a lot easier than it actually is to get those marked and extreme limitations. Now let's talk about disability for adults, because as I previously stated, the rules are completely different for adults than they are for children. For adults, Social Security is looking at your ability to engage in substantial gainful activity. There goes that $1,350 gross per month figure. So they say, are you, unable to engage in substantial gainful activity because you have physical, mental, or a combination of both, impairments which can be expected to last in death, or has lasted or is expected to last at least a year, and those impairments prevent you essentially from working full-time in any job. So there are also age classifications for adults. If you are under the age of 50, you are considered to be a younger individual. And so for younger individuals, the rules are the toughest, okay? You have to prove the most to be found disabled as a younger individual. As you get older, the rules are relaxed a bit. So as you're 50, the rules are relaxed a bit. You don't have to prove quite as much, generally speaking, to be found disabled. And once you reach 55, they're relaxed even more. So the idea is that as you get closer to retirement age, the rules are relaxed because you're aging out of the job market. Some of the skills that you have may not easily transfer to other skills. And so that's why it becomes easier as you get older to get approved for disability. So for adults, there is also a 5-step sequential analysis, but it's completely different than the one for children. So for adults, Social Security is looking to see, number one, are you working? And you may remember that I said earlier, you can work and be disabled. The question is, how much money are you making when you're working? So with step number one, if you're working, but you're not engaged in substantial gainful activity, so you're not making more than $1,350 gross per month, then that's okay. We're going to move to step 2 of the analysis. Do you have a severe impairment or condition that is expected to last at least a year? If that's satisfied, great. We can move on to step 3. Do you meet a listing? And so there are listings, and I'll show you in just a moment, for pretty much every system. There is an associated listing. If Social Security finds that you meet a listing, they are going to say you are disabled. If they find that you do not meet a listing, they are going to move on in the analysis to step 4. Does the condition prevent former employment? If you've never worked, that's easy. If you have worked, they want to know if you have limitations that would keep you from doing the jobs that you've done in the past 15 years. If the answer to that question is yes, it does prevent former employment, then they'll move on to step 5. Does it prevent you from doing any job? And the key with Social Security and disability is within any job standard, they mean full-time work without any sort of accommodations. So competitive employment. Can you perform the job just as they would hire the next person to do the job? And can you do it full-time? So here are the listings. The listings are broken down into functional categories based on systems. So for example, listing 12, mental disorders, includes autism. And when you read the requirements for the autism listing, it seems kind of straightforward, right? It seems like autism, what you would expect. You know, there's some qualitative deficits in verbal communication and nonverbal communication and social interaction, and you have significantly restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Those things need to be documented. And you must have, here go these words again, an extreme limitation of 1 or a marked limitation of 2 of the following areas of mental functioning. And there are 4 areas of mental functioning: how you understand, remember, or apply information, how you interact with others, how you concentrate, persist, or maintain pace, and how you adapt or manage yourself. So there are some similarities with the domains of functioning, but one of the big differences in adults' cases is they're not comparing you to adults of the same age that don't have limitations. Social Security, as an adult, is concerned with, can you do the work? And some things that are important as parents or perhaps adults with autism for you to know is that there are certain things that Social Security will not consider and cannot consider when they are deciding whether you're disabled. They cannot consider things like how you get to work. If you say, well, I don't have a driver's license, or I can't drive, I have too much anxiety, how you get to work is not relevant, because that doesn't make you disabled. It just means that you're not able, you don't have the transportation that you need. So they can't consider your transportation needs in making a disability determination. Social Security is also not able to consider whether you can get a job. What they are concerned with is how you are going to perform on the job. So just two things to keep in mind, and we'll come back to those things in a little bit more detail. But I'm sure many of you have heard that this process is long, and it is. And COVID has further complicated the process. Typically, for most people that apply for benefits, this is a 3-step process. This is whether you're an adult or a child. You'll file an initial application. It these days can take anywhere from 3 to 12 plus months to get a decision at initial. And about a third of people that do get approved for benefits will be approved at initial. So statistically, it's not horrible at initial, but it does take a lot longer now than it did pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, initial was more like 3 to 7 months. Now we're at 12 plus months. If you get denied at initial, you have to file an appeal if you want your case to continue, and you've got 60 days to do so. Filing the appeal means that you are asking for reconsideration. And the reconsideration step or stage usually takes 3 to 9-ish months to get a decision. And statistically, your chances of being approved at reconsideration are low, 10% or less. If you get denied at reconsideration, you've got 60 days. Then you need to file an appeal. And that appeal at that point is requesting a hearing in front of an administrative law judge. The wait times for hearings now, 6 months, I think, is really fast. More realistically, we're looking at over a year for hearings. And most people that do get approved for disability get approved after going to a hearing. So let's talk about the specific steps and what happens at each stage of the process. So when you first file your application, and you're either filing it over the phone, in person, not as much these days. And depending on what you're filing, you may also be able to file online. But most people these days, particularly if it's an SSI claim, are filing over the phone, or if you have an attorney, your attorney is doing it for you. So once that application is filed, your case or the claim goes to your local office, and they need to make sure at the local office that you qualify for the program that you have applied for. So if you apply for the wrong program, let's say you have an adult who is 18 years old, and you as the parents are not disabled, retired, or deceased, and your adult child has never worked. If you apply for SSDI for your adult child, you are going to get a technical denial because your adult child doesn't qualify for that program. If you get a technical denial, it will come pretty fast, a month or less. And that's kind of how you know, oops, I applied for the wrong program. That's okay. Maybe you needed to apply for SSI. And if you apply for SSI, they ask questions about your income, assets, resources, so that they can check to see if you qualify. Again, if you get a denial letter quickly, a month or less, generally speaking, and you've only applied for SSI, it's probably because you or your child has too much money in income, assets, or resources. So assuming that you meet the financial requirements for SSI, or that you have the work credits for SSDI, then your claim goes then to Disability Determination Services, also known as DDS. And DDS is the state agency that is responsible for developing the case and making a decision as to whether or not you're disabled. So when your file goes over to DDS, you are going to be assigned to an adjudicator. The adjudicator is the person that is responsible for your claim and responsible for making sure that your claim is processed, that all the appropriate steps are taken to process your claim so that a decision can be made. As part of the adjudicator's duties, they are going to be requesting and gathering medical, school, vocational, whatever kind of evidence that you have. They're going to be requesting that from the providers or institutions that you have listed on your application. And then those records are going to be reviewed by an in-house physician and or psychologist. So these physicians and psychologists are called state agency doctors. They work for Social Security. They're in-house at DDS, and their job is to review the records and give their opinions as to what they think your limitations or your child's limitations are. Now, oftentimes, especially pre-COVID, when reviewing the records, the adjudicator or perhaps the state agency doctor will say, okay, I've reviewed these records and I think that it would be helpful for this individual to be seen by a third party examiner. And that's what's called a consultative exam. Typically, there are two types of consultative exams, a physical and a psychological. Depending on your conditions and sometimes your medications, that will help the adjudicator or the state agency doctor to recommend the type of consultative exam that you need. And usually it's the adjudicator. So, for example, for an individual with autism, if when you filled out your application, if you only alleged having autism and you said, this is the reason that I can't work, it's because I have autism, then the adjudicator may order a psychological consultative examination for you. These exams are usually one-time exams, and they are exams that Social Security pays for. So they have their roster of providers. They generally try to send you to a provider that is close to where you live. It's not always possible, but generally that's what they try to do. And they will send the records that they deem to be appropriate for that examiner to review, and you will go to your appointment. So they'll make the appointment for you. They will send you a letter in the mail that says, you have an appointment on this date at this time with Dr. Burgess. And Dr. Burgess is going to do a psychological exam. When you go for this exam with Social Security, whether it's a physical or a psychological, but especially if it's a psychological, it is helpful if somebody else goes with you. So that can be a parent, that can be a friend, it can be a spouse, but it should be somebody that knows what's going on with you and how your condition or conditions are affecting your ability to work, because that person then can be a collateral witness and can tell the consultative examiner all about you and why they feel that you're not able to work. So once you go for this exam, then that examiner will prepare a report, send the report to Social Security, and within that report, there will be an analysis of, what diagnosis or diagnoses they believe that you have, how severe they think your symptoms are, and how they affect your functioning. Social Security, the adjudicator will then get that report, and sometimes the state agency doctors will look at that report and they will say, I agree with it, or I don't agree with it. It's not specific enough, or they'll just give their opinions. And then a vocational consultant is sometimes utilized to say, okay, based upon these limitations, I think that, Johnny can perform these kinds of jobs. Let me give you some examples of jobs that Johnny can perform. Or the situation may be that based upon your limitations, there aren't any jobs that Johnny could perform. And then Johnny gets a letter saying you've been approved for disability. So that's what happens at the initial level. So let's say that they decide there are jobs that Johnny can do. Johnny gets a denial letter. Johnny's got 60 days to file an appeal, which means you're filing for reconsideration. So when you file for reconsideration, here comes DDS again. Their job then is to look at any updated information that Johnny provides and making a new decision. Now, if there are no updates, then it makes it very easy. They'll just adopt their prior finding because there's no reason to disturb their prior finding. But if there are updates, then there could be a new opinion, which is much more helpful. Now, you may remember when I had the length of time slide up, 10% or less of people are typically approved at reconsideration. So there's, in most cases, not enough evidence that is reviewed that Social Security thinks should change their mind. So if Johnny gets another denial, he's got 60 days again. And at that point, he needs to request a hearing in front of an administrative law judge. Now, the administrative law judge is charged with doing what they call de novo review of the evidence. What that means is take a look at all of the evidence, including, anything from the state agency doctors, anything from the consultative examiner, any records that Social Security already reviewed, any new records. The judge looks at all of that with a fresh pair of eyes and makes a new decision. Now, the judge is not bound by those prior denials. He or she has the freedom, as long as they follow the rules, to make a brand new decision. The great thing about having a hearing is that you finally get a chance to talk, to explain this is what's going on. If you have a parent, or if you are a parent, and perhaps your adult or minor child isn't as insightful about their limitations, then it may be beneficial for you to be a witness and testify at the hearing as well. So this is the time where you can explain, and it's not a free-for-all. So you don't get to just walk in and say, okay, let me tell you about Johnny. This is what's going on. Hearings are structured. They're question and answer sessions. So the judge will have the opportunity to ask questions, to clear up things that are in the record. If you are represented by an attorney, your attorney will also have the opportunity to ask questions, to clear up things that are in the records, maybe to highlight things that the judge wouldn't know to ask because, the attorney, your attorney, has been working with you, has hopefully had the opportunity to prepare you for the hearing and knows, the things that are important for the judge to also know. So that's what happens during the hearing. Also, there is a vocational expert that attends the hearing these days by telephone, and the vocational expert gets to testify about how certain limitations would affect your ability to work. So given the process, the big question is, okay, how do I prove my disability case? And with autism, it is even more difficult to prove because there's just not as much known about autism as there is about, degenerative disc disease, right? So with degenerative disc disease, you can look at an MRI, you can say, okay, we see that there's, a bulging disc that's pressing on the nerve, we can get a pretty good idea of how that might affect you if you've got a disc pressing on your nerve. As opposed to, with autism, there isn't a test like that that's going to show you to what degree are you on the spectrum, right? So you have to rely heavily on evidence, actual evidence. So that includes medical records. And parents, this is where you can be extremely valuable. If you go to the doctor with your child, it's okay to give your input. You probably live with your child, you know exactly what's going on, and it's helpful for the doctor to know, from somebody else that's actually living with the child, what happens. This is what happens when I say no. This is what happens, when Johnny gets frustrated. So parents, you can certainly, as long as you're permitted to be in the room, provide some input that can be helpful to the doctor. And that input is going to find its way into the medical records. So Social Security is going to look at what the records say. How is Johnny doing? If Johnny regularly goes to the doctor for medication refills and says, I'm doing fine, no change, that's what the records are going to say. And it will be much more difficult to prove that Johnny is disabled and unable to work if all the medical records say Johnny's fine, Johnny's okay, no change. So you want to be specific. At many visits, particularly when there's mental health symptoms involved, doctors or psychologists will do a status exam, mental status exam. And so, they'll look at things like, are you having problems focusing? Are you agitated? Are your thoughts clear? Do you have any insight? So the results of those exams can be helpful. If there are changes in medication, that tends to show, especially if there are increases in medication or if there are additions to medication, tends to show that there is a problem that's not being adequately managed. So those are things that can be helpful in proving a disability case. If you or your adult child or minor child has worked, employment records can be very helpful, especially if there have been any disciplinary actions, performance appraisals. All of those things can be helpful to show how you perform in the workplace. And one of the biggest issues that I see with my clients that have autism is there are school records. There's an IEP. The IEP can give great information about some of the support that's required and some of the things that the teacher has done to make the learning experience better for Johnny. Maybe it's a very small class. Maybe it's, Johnny has to sit next to me, or I provide him with a lot of one-on-one, teaching throughout the day. He needs a lot of reminders to stay on task. So IEPs can be very helpful. The issue then becomes, how does that translate into the workforce? And the common sense side of me says, well, if there's a problem at school, there's going to be a problem at work. You don't have somebody at work to sit right there and say, okay, Johnny, you need to make sure that you get back on task. But what tends to happen in disability cases where the condition is autism is that Social Security's doctors will come back and say, okay, Johnny's got some limitations, but if he works in an environment that is not fast-paced, that doesn't have strict deadlines, perhaps in an environment where the instructions are simple, they're routine, they're repetitive. So he's doing the same thing every day, where he's not in contact with the public. So he doesn't have to interact with other people besides his coworkers, where he's in a more quiet environment. So he might not need, he won't be startled by loud noises. So they find this little bubble and they like to say, okay, well, he can work in this environment and he can do it full time and he can do it competitively. How do we prove that he's not able to do that if he's never worked? That becomes the challenge, because Social Security will look at it and they will say, well, in theory, all of these issues can be addressed by, putting him in this little bubble. And it's helpful if Johnny's maybe done some sort of community training through school, where they are assessing him in different work environments, or if he's worked with vocational rehabilitation or one of the private companies to have a work readiness assessment. Any sort of evidence that can show how Johnny reacts in a work setting can be helpful. Now, best case scenario, Johnny goes for a work readiness assessment and they say he's ready to work. We're going to help him find a job. They help him find a job and it's one that's great for Johnny. That's wonderful. But if that's not the case and Johnny has difficulties performing the job, then disability is something that should be considered. And the difficulties that are documented, that's the best kind of evidence to show he can't work full time, because look, he's had a work readiness assessment and they said he cannot work full time. He has to be reminded to do things over and over again, or he's frequently off task. He's fixated with his phone. He gets distracted by people walking by, and that will not work in a competitive work environment. So to the extent that you're able to get vocational evidence, that can be very helpful. Also, any sort of, even from school, teacher evaluations, disciplinary reports, emails from the teachers. If Johnny is in a program and he has a job coach is a wonderful resource, because the job coach goes to the workplace, talks to the supervisor, acts as a middle person to some degree to get feedback from the supervisor, and then talk to Johnny and say, okay, Johnny, here's some of the things that we need to work on. Let's go over how we, package, this type of box. Let's go over how we operate the cash register. So there's a lot of feedback that tends to be very helpful coming from job coaches. Okay, so at this point you're saying, all right, I understand, or I think I understand, there's a lot of information. What do I do now to, if I haven't applied for my child, to prepare him or her to get approved for disability? So the first thing that I would say is plan. If SSI is the only viable option right now because, either your child has never worked or you've never worked and won't qualify as a disabled adult child, if there are assets, then you want to consider things like an ABLE account, a special needs trust, to ensure that he or she could be eligible for SSI if they are not at this point in time. It is helpful in going through this process if you have IEPs, work evaluations, psychological evaluations. A lot of school systems will do these evaluations, and you've got a recent one. Or if you decide, this last school evaluation was 4 years ago, I'm going to send, I'm going to take Johnny to have a psychological evaluation. It can help in going through the process to provide that information to Social Security. So that eliminates the need for them to request it and just the wait that is associated with getting those records. So if you have supporting documentation, available when you file that application, submit the supporting documentation. Or if it comes in while the claim is pending, submit the supporting documentation, because it could be very helpful. I also would suggest that you explore the need for a vocational evaluation or assessment, a work readiness assessment, or a psychological evaluation if it's been years since Johnny's had one. I tend to find that it can be more helpful to go to someone you know, or that a friend has recommended for a comprehensive psychological evaluation. They tend to be more in depth than the evaluations that Social Security is able to obtain. If you or your child are receiving treatment, continue with your treatment. Follow your doctor's instructions. If you or your child are non-compliant, if you're not taking the medications that the doctor has recommended for your symptoms, that non-compliance can negatively affect your disability claim. Because what Social Security can then say is, well, he's having the symptoms because he's not taking the medications that his doctor told him to take. And if he would take the medications, the symptoms would go away. Now, that's rarely true, but that's the position that is generally taken. You also want to discuss your plans to file for disability with the doctor. See what the doctor thinks about it. Doctors, psychologists, mental health professionals, counselors, job coaches can all be instrumental in a disability case because they have a history of treatment, with your child or with you. And, through that treatment, they've been able to formulate opinions, and they can put those opinions in writing. It doesn't necessarily need to be, oh, I think he's disabled. But what's more helpful is, I've been treating Johnny for this amount of time for autism. His diagnosis is supported by A, B, and C. We prescribe medication for Johnny to help with outbursts. The medication is not effective. We've had to change medication 6 times. I think that as a result, Johnny has difficulty, interacting with others. He's very spontaneous, and he needs to be in an environment where he's got supervision. So those are the kinds of things that are helpful opinions from doctors, as opposed to saying, Johnny's disabled. Well, Social Security gets to make that decision. So you want to help to the extent that you can with explaining what the issues are with Johnny and, being able to work. Also, if you have a child in school or in a transition academy, it can be very helpful to talk to the teacher. Have the teacher fill out a teacher questionnaire, which, if we're dealing with a minor child, the teacher questionnaires follow those 6 domains in great detail. And so it lays out each domain, and it asks several questions about how severe is the child's ability to respond to criticism, play with classmates. So there's so many questions that are involved in that teacher questionnaire that help to support the level of, or the degree of impairment in each domain of functioning. So that can be very helpful. As I stated earlier, if your child or you are employed or have a job coach, or have had some sort of vocational training, talk to someone there and ask for a statement, just explaining, okay, this is what we have to do for Johnny. Johnny is able to work, but he works 10 hours a week, and we have to make sure that we give him directions. We give him one thing to do, come back, check, make sure that it's done, redirect him as necessary. So you want to have any input from an employer about any accommodations that Johnny is currently given in the workplace. And lastly, but not least, you want to consult with an attorney about whether disability is a viable option, whether there's going to be the evidence to prove a disability case. And you always have the option of filing an application on your own. You do not have to have an attorney, but it's certainly something that is more beneficial to have an expert to represent you and to guide you through the process. And with that, I appreciate your time and attention, and it is time for questions.
Thank you for that presentation. That was so thorough and good. Siobhán, did we resolve the question issue?
So yeah, no. So we aren't sure if there is a Zoom bug happening right now. So Laura and I are able to talk to each other over chat, but we noticed that the chat box is pretty quiet tonight. So if you are unable to ask questions in the chat window, don't worry, you will be getting the contact information for our panelists this evening, and we will make sure you'll be able to connect with them.
I'll ask one question that we hear all the time. So I think people may be interested in it, even if they didn't. And you talked about submitting evidence when you file your application. But just kind of practically speaking, Anjel, do you recommend people throw up everything they have, or should they pick and choose pieces of evidence? How do they decide what to send with their application?
So it depends. And I hate to say that it depends, but what Social Security typically does when you file an application is when they're requesting records, evidence, they will ask for 1 year prior to the date that you claim you became disabled. If you're claiming you became disabled at birth and you're now 20, well, it's not going to be helpful for them to have evidence from, the last 18 years. What's going to be more helpful is for them to have evidence from 18 to 20. So if you're dealing with a child's case, generally speaking, I would say a year or two tends to be the most helpful because it's the most recent. And usually the evidence will give a good overview. So it'll give a history and say, this child has a history of autism diagnosed at age 6. That's all they need to know. What's more important is what's going on right now that makes you disabled. So I would say recent history, recent evaluations, just things that have happened in the last year or two are most helpful for disability cases.
I think that's helpful for them. Okay. Well, I can continue to ask more questions, but I think also that was very comprehensive. I think that was a good.
Absolutely. So Laura, if there are any other questions that you think come up pretty frequently in your conversations, we could do a couple more just as more of a moderated panel right now. I am going to guess that we are having a technical difficulty with the chat box for our attendees, and we really apologize about that. However, we will make sure that you can connect with our panelists and make sure that you have both Laura and Anjel's information so that any of our attendees tonight can reach out directly to them.
Okay, I'll ask another question then, which is, can people receive SSI and SSDI at the same time?
Yes. However, the scenario where that tends to happen is if your SSDI amount is lower than what you would receive in SSI. So for example, the SSI maximum for this year is $841. If you've only worked for a couple of years or you've worked very part-time, you may not have been able to pay much into the system. So let's say your SSDI benefit amount is $300 a month. You're not going to be able to live off of $300 a month. So what you would do is you would apply for SSDI to get your $300 a month, and then you would also apply for SSI to get enough to bump you up to the SSI $841 a month. So you can get a combination, but if your SSDI amount is going to be over that $841, you're only going to get SSDI. So you can't stack the two if we're talking about more than $841 a month.
And I always tell people, if you're trying to figure out which benefit you're receiving, a good key is just look at how much money you're getting every month, because that's often an indicator.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is typically the indicator.
Another question we hear all the time is about in-kind support and maintenance, also referred to as ISM, and how that affects the benefit you're receiving, which, to clarify, is always going to affect SSI. So what is that?
So if you are living with someone and you are not paying rent, or you could be living on your own and you're not paying rent, somebody else is supporting you, SSA considers that to be in-kind support and maintenance. And the thing about SSI is, because it's an income and asset sensitive program, it is designed to help people have shelter, clothing, have all their basic needs met. So if somebody else is contributing to your basic needs, then they are going to withhold a third of your SSI payment each month. So if I have a 19-year-old son and he's living with me and he's not paying me any rent, but he receives SSI, he is not going to get his full $841 a month. They are going to withhold a third of that for the in-kind support and maintenance. On the flip side of that, if I wanted to make sure that he did get his full $841 a month, we could enter into a rental agreement, but the amount of money that I would charge him for rent would have to be fair market value. So it can't be, it's the $100 a month my son's special. It has to be a reasonable amount of rent that you would charge anybody else that's not your son to live there. And so if you do that, as a parent, you want to remember that you're now also a landlord and there are some potential tax implications that come from, receiving rent from your son. So it's just something to weigh as a parent, whether or not you want to charge rent. And you charging rent cannot be contingent upon the receipt of SSI. So you can't have a rental agreement that says, I, Anjel Burgess, am going to charge Johnny Burgess $300 a month in rent if he gets SSI. That's not going to fly. They're going to say, no, that's not a real rental agreement. So it's really like a landlord-tenant type of agreement that you have to enter into. And then you would submit that agreement to Social Security and say, here's my proof that we have this rental agreement. It's for fair market value. It's for what I would charge anybody else to rent a room from me.
What about when is the earliest that people can start their application for SSI before their child turns 18 or upon that mark?
So up until the child is 18, the deeming rules apply. So they are going to, Social Security is going to deem part of your income to the child. So you want to wait until your child is 18 to apply. So that way they're looking solely at the child's income, the 18-year-old's income.
A lot of our parents are like, no, we got it. It's 18. We have to take care of everything. But sometimes you just got to wait.
Yes.
You can't do it beforehand.
That's right. That's right. You're going to get a technical denial. So you don't want to do that.
Okay. I don't have anything else off the top of my head immediately. I can keep brainstorming, but I think that's good information.
To run into this issue, we've literally never had this technical issue before, but you gotta love technology, and Zoom is always surprising you. Oh, well, for all of our attendees tonight, again, we apologize for the technical difficulty with the chat box. We will make sure that you get Anjel and Laura's contact information so you can reach out directly with those questions. Be on lookout for that email coming to the email address that you used to register for this program. Again, tonight's program is being recorded, and once that recording is live, we will also be sending out a copy of that with the link to the YouTube video. Anjel and Laura, thank you both so much for giving your time to our community tonight. This is a program that we put on every year in a different form or fashion, and there is always so much interest and such a need around this topic. So we really just appreciate you being part of this tonight.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Everybody.
We really appreciate all of you joining us. Be on the lookout for that email tomorrow morning, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.